Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Michael Green, and just as we prepare the slides that I've produced, I'm going to be talking about one possible future way ahead, which is underground coal gasification. And this is well known to many of you in India, as you've been active in this field. And my object in this short presentation is to bring you up to date with what's happening around the world in India. So when we get the slides, I'll get cracking on that, and I can assure the chairman I shall be very short. Can I ask how many people are knowledgeable of or aware of underground coal gasification? If you'd raise your hand. We got not too many. Oh, okay, well, perhaps I've got some work to do. Well, you'll know that it goes back at least 100 years to the trials in Durham and UK, and the trials in the Soviet Union, as it was then. I said 100 years, but the real program kicked off after the Second World War, and then was taken up in the US. And there's been a massive amount of research done in UCG, and it's been in parallel with the developments in oil and gas, because in the early days you're hard pressed to get a horizontal well, whereas now it's something that is just taken for granted. So many of the techniques that are now available in the oil and gas industry are at the disposal of underground coal gasification, and are able to make it a much more reliable process than it was perhaps 10 or 20 years ago. It's got its supporters, of course, because it's got these advantages that I'll talk about when I get a slide up, but there are some drawbacks that I really think you should be aware of, and perhaps one of the things I will say is that it's often been said that it's perhaps too good to be true, some of the things you can get from underground coal gasification, because you don't need a reactor, you just simply drill a few holes and away you go. It's not as simple as that, and as many of the sort of smaller entrepreneurial companies have found out in this revival of UCG in the last, probably since the year 2000, it's something you can easily come unstuck with. I think one of the dangers of UCG is that you try and do it in too shallow a coal, and that gives you problems with the leakage and contamination of surface waters, and that's probably been one of its main betoirs in the last few years. So I'll just pick a couple of those points up as soon as we get going. Right, okay, thanks. Right. Okay, you've got the slides now, so I can now start. This is going to be a whip through this and won't do too much of the introduction. I will, it's run away with itself. That's the back one, okay. Right, okay, this slide is just saying that my company has had the honour of some experience in India, going back to 2006, and it's involved both some of the bids for blocks, and also I've had good links with one of the universities here, the Indian Institute of Technology in Mumbai, where we've a number of UCG projects have taken place. The world situation, I mean, there are people that say that coal is finished in the West, and that's certainly not the message that's coming through at this conference. And in fact, if you look at the IEA graph for coal production, it's clear that there is a declining already in the production in the most regions of the world. The Asia-Pacific region has doubled its coal production in the last 10 years, and so there's definitely a need, as this conference has continued to emphasize, and that really implies for coal higher efficiency and potentially in the longer term CCS, coal carbon capture and storage. So with that seen, and which has been set already at the conference, we can talk about UCG. And for those that haven't really followed it recently, that it's a process where you have coal in the coal seam. You drill into that coal seam with two holes in its basic form. One to get the what's called the oxidants, which is a combination of oxygen, maybe enriched air, maybe water, and definitely water, and also, more recently, CO2. And out comes the gases then burn, and you then have a production well to produce these produce the syngas. Very much a parallel process to the surface gasifier. But there are things to watch out for. There are no boundaries to this process, so if you over-pressurize the cavity, then the contents will move into the overburden. You may have aquifers in the region which have to be avoided, and certainly you have to avoid polluting them. And that's the emphasis of this slide. And you can see the sort of combination of gases you get from it, which are very useful: hydrogen, carbon monoxide, methane, and of course CO2. The technology trends over this, I decided by saying 100 years, but over the last 30 or 40 years, have moved from a very simple system where you simply rely on the permeability of the coal to control the process, through to creating a pathway in that, and then actually controlling the position at which the oxidants reach the coal. So as we move down from the simple systems that the Soviet Union had, and then we go on to what Europe and Australia and the US have been developing based on horizontal drilling, and in the latter case, the use of a coiled tube to make sure that the gases are reaching the point of the coal that you need to. And the trend throughout this long period has been improving the control and the efficiency of conversion of the process. Remember that UCG is a mining process and a conversion process at the same time. So why UCG? Well, I said it may be too good to be true. First of all, it's an elegant solution that we don't have to build galleries and bring down mechanical equipment into the coal seam. It's all done from surface. There's nobody working underground. It gives security of supply to the many countries around the world that have coal, and arguably the costs of UCG, though we really haven't got to the active commercial stage in many cases, are significantly lower than in terms of gas price per million cubic feet than perhaps the competitors, and particularly natural gas. And what has changed in this is the advances in UCG technology. I'll tend to hint at the beginning. And if you ever have to come to carbon capture and storage, the pre-combustion process is ready-made for extraction of the CO2. And you'll be doing this at the pressure of the process, which means a much smaller, system. So it is too good to be true. People would then say, well, that's it, we'll just drill a couple of holes and do it. We have to be much more careful about the conditions under which this process is operated. We have to be very careful about the selection of the seams that we have to choose, and during the operation and the close down of the process, that we have to ensure that there is no spread of pollutants. And this has been one of the problems that have occurred in the past. Now, the worldwide position on UCG is just, if you don't have to look too carefully at the detail there, it's pretty well was all around the world. Probably everybody with a coal supply in the year 2014 was doing something in UCG, including India, with the main concentrations of work in Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, Australia, China. China is very big in UCG, and to a lesser extent the US, which had the big program in the 80s. But I go on 3 years now, and I'll now touch on my finger on one of the problems that occurred. But this list is now much shorter. We've still got China active in UCG, and they've now, even they have slightly modified their approach to, rather than go straight for a commercial program, they've realized that a research center, and to analyze and to investigate and to model and to monitor accurately these processes is required. So the China program I put pretty well at the front. I think India's coming up now with its 8 also, I'll mention those later, blocks that it's identifying. There's a significant European program which has been running right back since the Tulin program in the 80s, and is continuous, and there's been a lot of work done in Europe, a lot of technical and modelling work done. And then we go to the other side of this, which is companies like Link Energy and Carbon Energy in Australia, both in administration, both having severe problems with their environmental regulators, and that's an example of just how these things can change in a matter of a couple of years. The project at Angwin that many of you know about seems to plod on. It seems to produce its 100 megawatts of power. And then there's the major program in South Africa, which I'll just do a slide on. This has been a well-organised program by Eskom in South Africa. They started in 2001. They methodically gone through the whole process from site selection through to the pilot. They ran a pilot for 2 or 3 years. They then started to use that gas in the local power generation. They then built a pipeline to the power station and co-fired some processes, and they finally have got a program going right through to commercialisation. There's the Spanish program, which I would jump through, but I hold that up as one of the gold standards of UCG. And perhaps touch on a couple of slides to wind up on India. India has been analysed by people like Anil Kardzi, who was then at IIT, and identified the deep coal as the place to go for UCG in India. And there's plenty of it, both lignite and coal. You've got these policies, which I don't need to tell you about, and you've got the technology here, or some of it, at IIT to help to produce this. So India's in a good position to do something on IIT. I'll skip that one. We find in the West that managing the project risks associated with this are essential. We have to talk to regulators about things like layers of protection approach, and you don't get very far in UCG without satisfying the regulators that the environmental impact will be minimal. So to sum up, we've got coal power generation is still growing worldwide, and UCG via IGCC is going to be a viable option. It's one that you could almost pick up now, provided you go about it the right way. It's essential to have the correct site, the right depth particularly, and then to use the key technologies for process and environmental control. It's essential to have a pilot in the coal that you're going to develop the commercial program, and that has to be fully instrumented and monitored. And you can take advantage of then the confidence of the 70 or so UCG trials that have taken place in the past. So these opportunities exist for collaboration on UCG around the world. I think the solution will be some kind of collaborative program, because it's a lot easier. And the main centres are in a position to drive this forward, and I think India is probably one that could take the lead. Thank you very much.